They drove through an intersection, and then he called the McAllen Police Department for help. When they caught up with El Puma, he didn't fight back and didn't have any weapons. He admitted he was El Puma. Even though there wasn't an arrest warrant for El Puma that day, the DEA had been told by Mexican authorities that they would arrest him in Mexico if they couldn't get a warrant in the US.
El trabajo de este lado, los matan, los levantan, los desaparecen prácticamente y se regresan para aquel lado. Por eso la policía nunca va a poder dar con el paradero.
For police officers in Mexico, their career is filled with difficult, often deadly choices due to the influence of drug cartels. Officers face a brutal decision. They can stay clean and remain dedicated to their role in law enforcement, but this path often makes them a target for the cartels, who view uncooperative officers as threats. Many officers choose the safer option of accepting bribes to look the other way when it comes to cartel activities. But messing with the cartel, in any shape or form, is an extremely dangerous game, and it is one that many pay for with their life.
A deadly night in Juarez after 2 officers were killed and another injured in shootings last night. It all happened around the same time across the city.
Carlos Landin Martinez, otherwise known as El Puma, was a corrupt cop who became famous for living a double life. It was this double life that would eventually earn him a spot on the DEA's most wanted list. Carlos was a very well-respected law enforcement officer working in Tamaulipas. He was particularly well known for his work in the homicide task force and was nicknamed El Puma because of his aggressive approach to fighting crime. But despite his reputation, Carlos was not at all the kind of person his co-workers believed him to be. During the day, he worked as a police officer, but at night, he was deeply involved with the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas. The Gulf Cartel was one of the oldest and most powerful drug trafficking organizations in Mexico, and it operated with brutal efficiency. While working with this cartel, Carlos helped to coordinate an insane amount of drug smuggling across the US-Mexico border.
Over the river or by lanchas, fishing boats that landed along Padre Island.
Carlos became an essential figure in the cartel's drug trafficking operations, controlling the crucial Reynosa corridor. This route allowed huge amounts of narcotics to be moved across the border to the United States. Drugs were smuggled in lots of different ways, including through hidden tunnels, across the Rio Grande on boats, and in vehicles to designated stash houses in Texas. From there, they would be transported further into major US cities like Dallas, Houston, Chicago, and New York. Carlos's connections and knowledge of law enforcement allowed him to go undetected for years, even as he funneled millions of dollars to himself and the cartel. Within the cartel, Carlos initially worked under Gregorio Sauceda Gamboa. During that time, the Reynosa corridor was officially headed by Gregorio Sauceda Gamboa, or El Caramuela, a former investigative police officer turned kingpin, who reported to Ociel Cárdenas Guillén, the top leader of the cartel. Gamboa was a former police officer turned cartel kingpin known as El Caramuela. He reported directly to Ociel Cárdenas Guillén, the top leader of the cartel. But Gamboa's health began to decline due to substance abuse and a cancer diagnosis, which weakened his hold over the Reynosa corridor. That's when Carlos saw an opportunity for himself to take on even more power. He began consolidating his influence within the cartel and started accumulating an incredible amount of cash. Carlos's betrayal caused some internal conflicts within the cartel and led to a major power struggle. Some cartel members still supported Gamboa, while others were beginning to back Carlos. Ultimately, the power struggle led to murders of high-ranking cartel officials as the group fought for control. US law enforcement agencies had been monitoring Carlos's activities since the late 1990s, but hadn't yet been able to capture him. This was because Carlos was still living a double life and kept his illegal activities carefully hidden. In 2007, the DEA launched Operation Puma, which was intended to bring down Carlos by dismantling his entire criminal network. Multiple Mexican and US agencies worked together, with both countries desperate to take this powerful drug lord down. Despite careful planning, the way Carlos actually ended up getting arrested was quite a surprise. A DEA agent named Leonardo Silva, who was off duty at the time, spotted Carlos by chance in a supermarket in McAllen, Texas. He recognized Carlos from his DEA work and decided to discreetly follow him after calling for backup. A short time later, the local cops arrived and Carlos was finally taken into custody. He didn't even try to fight back. Carlos's arrest marked years of evading law enforcement, and his takedown was considered a major achievement in the fight against the cartel. Now facing a slew of charges, including drug trafficking, conspiracy, and money laundering, Carlos's defense team tried to claim that the case was built on unreliable testimonies from criminals seeking lighter sentences. But the prosecution fought back with a convincing case that included drug seizure evidence that was supposedly connected to Carlos's trafficking network. Despite the defense's claims of insufficient evidence, the jury found him guilty on all counts. His sentence was set at life in prison, although it was later reduced with an adjusted release date set for October 2029. His conviction and sentence was celebrated by both the United States and Mexico. The DEA would also acknowledge that had these agencies not worked together, this capture would not have been possible. To many, this case was proof that in the fight against the cartel, the US and Mexico are always going to be stronger if they unite and work together against violent crime. Carlos would ultimately pass away while behind bars in December of 2021, bringing an end to a notorious and violent legacy. Law enforcement corruption is rampant throughout Mexico. Many officers are allegedly working alongside the cartels, basically undermining the very positions they have within law enforcement. This is what happened in the case of Flores Mendoza. Flores Mendoza was a top police chief in Jalisco. He collaborated closely with the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, otherwise known as the CJNG. He helped to provide them with protection so that they could continue with their operations without being detected by law enforcement. He became known for his ruthless manipulation of both the government and cartel connections. Mendoza's power was unmatched. He had the ability to control law enforcement forces in Jalisco's rural areas. At the same time, he also had major influence over law enforcement in other municipalities and helped with coordinating operations and security. El Mencho, CJNG's leader and one of the world's most wanted drug traffickers, worked closely with Mendoza. He used Mendoza's influence to shield cartel operations in Jalisco. Allegedly, CJNG paid Mendoza millions to turn a blind eye and ensure the cartel's protection. But when the US discovered Mendoza's close association with CJNG, they sanctioned him in June 2022. They also confiscated his US-based assets and barred him from conducting any financial activities in the country. Surprisingly, Mexican authorities issued no arrest warrant, and Mendoza mysteriously disappeared. Many believe that he was killed off by the cartels. Others suspect he could be in hiding. It's possible that we'll never know what truly happened to Flores Mendoza.
We end today's show on another subject, the bombshell case here in New York. Sado Garcia Luna, Mexico's former top security official, once charged with leading the fight against narco-trafficking, was convicted Tuesday for accepting millions of dollars in bribes from the Sinaloa cartel.
Sado Garcia Luna is one of the most controversial figures in modern Mexican law enforcement history. His involvement in organized crime, despite being a high-profile and respected member of law enforcement, earned him a massive fall from grace. His story began in July of 1968 in Mexico City, where he grew up. As an adult, he took a deep interest in security and intelligence and began working for high-profile intelligence agencies, including the Center for National Security and Investigation in the 1980s. With a focus on counterintelligence and security, Garcia Luna rose quickly within the ranks. By the late 1990s, he was part of the Federal Judicial Police and later was appointed director of the newly established Federal Investigation Agency in 2001. This position would ultimately be the foundation that would allow him to hold major influence within Mexican law enforcement. In 2006, Garcia Luna was appointed Secretary of Public Security by President Felipe Calderón. This was a very important role during Calderón's administration. This is because, at the time, the president had launched an aggressive war on drugs to fight back against cartel violence and influence across Mexico. As secretary, Garcia Luna controlled Mexico's federal police force and oversaw massive operations that were intended to dismantle drug trafficking organizations and reduce cartel power. His position made him one of the most powerful figures in Mexico's law enforcement structure. But of course, all along, he was secretly living a double life.
Encabezar una empresa criminal continua y conspiración para traficar cocaína, pero fue hasta este día que el juez Coogan dictó la sentencia. Sí, el mismo juez, la misma corte que sentenció a cadena perpetua al narcotraficante Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, ex líder del cártel de Sinaloa.
Multiple testimonies and documents would later reveal that Garcia Luna had allegedly accepted millions of dollars in bribes from the Sinaloa cartel, led by the infamous El Chapo Guzmán. In exchange, he was supposedly giving the cartel critical law enforcement intelligence. This included allowing the cartel to evade raids, safely transport drug shipments, and basically continue to operate without facing any legal consequences. According to evidence, Garcia Luna allegedly used his federal authority to actively protect the Sinaloa cartel. He did this by assigning federal officers to serve as bodyguards and escorts for cartel leaders. He even gave them uniforms and credentials to make sure that the cartel would be able to keep moving throughout Mexico and the United States without law enforcement getting in their way. In December of 2005, Garcia Luna famously orchestrated a fake rescue of kidnapping victims, supposedly taken hostage by drug traffickers. The operation, which was aired on national television, was later exposed as a setup where the alleged criminals were detained without due process. Not only that, but they were also forced to play along with the whole fake narrative. This incident raised questions about Garcia Luna's tactics and intentions. A lot of people wondered if the only reason he did it was to try to boost his own image, since he had been receiving a lot of criticism at the time. Following the staged raid and other questionable actions, the U.S. New York Strike Force decided to get involved. This is a multi-agency unit that is focused on fighting crime. They began to investigate Garcia Luna's connections to the Sinaloa cartel, and what they found was shocking. Testimonies from cartel members and associates revealed the astounding truth that Garcia Luna had been a double agent for years. He was responsible for not only bribe payments, but sharing tons of important insider information with cartel leaders. In December 2019, Garcia Luna was arrested by U.S. federal agents in Dallas, Texas, on charges of drug trafficking and conspiracy. The U.S. government claimed he had collaborated with the Sinaloa cartel, taking millions in bribes and aiding their operations for a whole decade. This discovery came after Garcia Luna had worked closely with high-profile United States government figures for years, including Barack Obama, who had trusted him fully.
We saw in the trial, we saw pictures of him with different high-ranking members of the U.S. government, like Hillary Clinton, like Barack Obama. So the U.S. government and the U.S. agencies really trusted this guy for years, while Mexico was becoming the most dangerous place on earth for journalists, and thousands of people were dying and continue dying in Mexico because of the violence, and here in the United States because of the overdoses.
The discovery that Garcia Luna had so many people fooled for so long came as a major embarrassment for both the United States and Mexico. Here, they thought they had this very influential person who was helping in the fight to bring down the cartels. Meanwhile, all along, not only was he a cartel leader himself, but he was using all the information that he was being given against the government.
He should hold accountable both countries, because this person was sort of a triple agent. He was working with the Mexican government, he was working with the DEA, and he was working for the Sinaloa cartel.
During his trial, evidence included witness accounts from former Sinaloa cartel members. They told stories of personal payments and incidents where Garcia Luna would meet with cartel leaders and provide logistical support. While Garcia Luna pleaded not guilty, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Prosecutors made it clear that they would be seeking the maximum sentence possible if he was convicted, which was life behind bars. Following a 4-week-long trial, the verdict was finally revealed in February of 2023, guilty on all counts. He was ultimately sentenced to 38 years behind bars. Born in Tamaulipas, Mexico, Aurelio Elcano Flores began his career in law enforcement as a police officer in his home state. However, while he was considered to be a respectable cop, he was also secretly involved in recruiting others into the Gulf Cartel, collecting drug money, and escorting large shipments of cartel drugs to the U.S. border. Around 2001, while still serving as a police officer, Flores began working even more directly for the Gulf Cartel. He rose through the ranks to become a major transporter of narcotics within Mexico to the U.S. border and became the cartel's top representative in the important border town of Los Guerra, Tamaulipas, Mexico. As the plaza boss for Los Guerra, he oversaw the mass distribution of cocaine and marijuana into the United States on a daily basis. On June 10, 2009, Mexican authorities finally managed to take down Flores and bring him into custody. In August of 2011, he would then be extradited to the United States to face justice for drug conspiracy charges. Following a trial that lasted over 2 weeks, Flores was convicted by a federal jury on February 26, 2013. His conviction was 1 count of conspiracy to distribute 5 kilograms or more of cocaine and 1,000 kilograms or more of marijuana, knowing and intending the substances would be unlawfully imported into the United States. Flores was sentenced to 35 years in prison and ordered to forfeit $15 billion in drug proceeds as part of a financial judgment. Ivan Reyes Andrade was not just a police officer who was secretly working for the cartel. He was the commander of the Sensitive Investigative Unit, or SIU, within the Mexican Federal Police, an incredibly important and powerful position. The SIU was a specialized unit that worked closely with U.S. law enforcement agencies, including the DEA, to fight against drug trafficking and other criminal activities. He served as the #1 point of contact for information sharing between the SIU and United States authorities. Despite his incredibly important position, Andrade continued to work closely with multiple different drug cartels. He would often accept bribes in exchange for providing sensitive law enforcement information to these criminal organizations. Perhaps most famously, Andrade conspired with the El Seguimiento 39 cartel, which is associated with the Sinaloa cartel and the Beltran Leyva organization. Even in 2016, when he was taking part in a joint investigation with U.S. law enforcement, Andrade was meeting with leaders of El Seguimiento 39. He was sharing all the information he had been given about the investigation and even accepted a whopping $290,000 bribe to help the cartel. After a massive investigation, Andrade was finally arrested by U.S. authorities, and he pleaded no contest to charges of obstructing and conspiring to obstruct a U.S. investigation into a drug cartel. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison for these offenses. He would also be convicted of participating in a cocaine trafficking conspiracy. He admitted to accepting bribes to assist the El Seguimiento 39 cartel in shipping cocaine from Mexico to the United States. For that crime, he received an additional 10 years behind bars. Each one of these corrupt cops learned a critical lesson. If you betray your own government by working for the cartel, justice is going to catch up with you eventually. It is very likely that right this minute, there are other corrupt cops working with the cartel who have not yet been caught. But how many are there, and how long until they are taken down? Only time will tell. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below.
¿Se siente miedo?
No, ya estamos acostumbrados.
En México, matar a un periodista te viene saliendo entre los 5,000 y 40,000 pesos. No es caro.
Ya no hay nada, ya no hay nada. ¿Eh?
Bueno, ya no me las... Eso te fui yo.
Ya.
It was just another night at the office of a local journalist in the Mexican city of Salina Cruz. Haber Lopez was wrapping up some online reports at his modest radio studio when gunshots suddenly rang out. When his 12-year-old son emerged from hiding, he found his dad lying in a pool of blood. Just like that, Haber's life was stolen by bullets, all for daring to speak up against corruption. You see, the reporter's unforgivable crime was publishing a story that accused the wrong politician of shady dealings around new infrastructure projects in town. A total no-no in some corners of Mexico, where telling hard truths can get you killed by brutal forces profiting from silence. Behind the tourist-friendly images of beach getaways, Mexico has become one of the world's most dangerous places for journalists brave enough to resist censorship. When factual reporting is considered the gravest offense in the criminal underworld's eyes, shining light on injustice means putting your own future at risk. So why do truth-tellers like Haber keep putting their lives on the line to break the quiet for a shot at something greater? The democratic dream of giving voice to the voiceless, no matter how heavily armed their oppressors may be. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press. We tend to take these rights for granted, don't we? The ability to share ideas and information without fear of being censored or punished is the core of any society calling itself free. After all, a truly free press is what keeps authority figures in check by exposing corruption and giving a voice to the voiceless. Journalists play a vital role by painstakingly pursuing facts over any agendas trying to parade things like propaganda or disinformation as truth. It's a pretty beautiful concept, right? Well, while most people might tend to take this all for granted, in some places around the world, the simple act of speaking your mind or reporting on facts can quickly turn into an unimaginable act of bravery, one that could lead to harassment, imprisonment, torture, or even death at the hands of those in power. For independent journalists brave enough to use truth as a shining spotlight, exposing those craving secrecy, almost nowhere is that struggle over freedom of expression being waged more ruthlessly than in modern-day Mexico.
En México, matar a un periodista te viene saliendo entre los 5,000 y 40,000 pesos. No es caro. Entonces tenemos precio en nuestra cabeza.
Over here, doing your job as a truth-telling media worker can instantly turn you into a marked target for extreme violence and censorship. And it's all thanks to the powerful criminal organizations and their corrupt government enablers, desperately trying to control the flow of information.
And director of a Mexican online news site Noticias Web, Haber Lopez, has been fatally shot, becoming the 5th journalist to be murdered in the country since the beginning of the year.
The tragic story of journalist Haber Lopez Vasquez provides a chilling look at just how constant and grave that danger is for Mexican reporters that are unwilling to ever stay silent. And, unfortunately for him, he ended up having to pay the ultimate price for just doing his job. Haber Lopez knew the risks of his work, and he sure was no rookie when it came to stirring the pot with his journalistic work. For nearly 2 decades, the 42-year-old man had been running small online news ops and using social media to call out corrupt politicians across Oaxaca state. Holding the powerful accountable was his passion, even if it could get him in deep trouble. Just days before his untimely demise, Haber had dropped a bombshell report accusing a local legislator named Arminda Espinoza Cartels of some serious corruption related to her shady re-election tactics. According to Haber's expose, Espinoza had been pressuring companies involved in a major federal infrastructure project to threaten their own workers unless they voted to keep her in power. It was the kind of hard-hitting accountability journalism that came naturally to Lopez over his long-spanning career. After all, he had spent the better part of his adult life dedicated to digging up dirt on crooked officials, but he had no idea that this particular investigation would mark him for retaliation, and it all went down on the night of February 10th, 2022. Haber was putting the final touches on some new stories from the inside of his modest radio studio, and just as the sun dipped below the horizon, that's when a white pickup truck pulled up outside. One of the 2 men inside calmly exited the vehicle and made his way through the entrance. In a burst of unfathomable violence, followed by deafening silence, gunshots rang out. Lopez was shot in cold blood, struck down by bullets in front of his own 12-year-old son Oscar, who could only cower and hide as his father met a shockingly abrupt demise. Just like that, Haber Lopez became the latest addition to the tragic statistic of Mexican reporters getting offed in retaliation for simply doing their jobs as truth-tellers. You see, in the first few months of 2022 alone, he was the 5th journalist killed nationwide in what would go on to become one of the deadliest years yet for the country's rapidly endangered media professionals. But the sickening irony is that Lopez wasn't some internationally known investigator or crusading television personality. He was a local reporter running a couple of small online news operations and using social media to share his findings. His final story, alleging corruption by Espinoza, plainly struck a nerve with certain powerful guys who later set out to destroy him. So when the authorities arrested 2 suspects at the scene of Lopez's murder outside his studio, One of them turned out to be Espinosa's own brother. Yet despite this obvious conflict of interest, suggesting potential ties to the crime, Espinosa herself was never charged. And needless to say, this vicious attack sent shockwaves through the local journalism community in Oaxaca and Salina Cruz.
Lately, we've fallen victim to criminality, to abuse of power, situations that are beyond our control. As a media worker, I'm very worried. I trust in the authorities and ask them to do their job as they should.
Hiram Moreno, a veteran Oaxacan journalist who himself had been shot 3 times in 2019 after reporting on local criminal groups, echoed that tragic reality.
We'll keep on informing, but the most important thing is to stay alive. There are definitely issues you cannot address. You cannot address the topic of presidents connected to organized crime. You cannot address the topic of insecurity in the region of the interoceanic corridor.
In the aftermath of this ordeal, an unmistakable chill spread across the region as reporters realized they may have entered into what press freedom groups call a silent zone. So, what does this mean exactly? Well, besides the tragic loss of one brave journalist, there's also tons of other consequences that can drastically change Mexico's already troubled journalistic landscape. Journalists in Mexico are facing insane dangers just for trying to do their jobs and report the truth. Can you imagine being seen as an enemy of the state simply for asking tough questions and trying to hold the powerful accountable? Here's the deal. When a reporter gets slaughtered in Mexico, like what happened to Haber Lopez, it's not just one isolated and tragic event. It's a deliberate tactic used by hardcore criminals and shady officials to control the flow of information. By murdering a journalist who dug too deep, they're sending a chilling message to any other media folks who try to uncover the dirty secrets behind their illegal schemes and scandals. In this dark reality that's holding so much of the country in a chokehold, reporters instantly become public enemy number 1 when they dare to report facts and demand answers. They get threats, censorship, exile, or even straight up eliminated by this unholy alliance of drug lords, crooked politicians, and sketchy power players who are all profiting from Mexico's spiral. That being said, the journalists left in that region have to make a tough call. They can either surrender their pens and cameras, pick a side in this war between facts and total oblivion, or they can go ahead and risk being silenced themselves, all for trying to shed a little light on the darkness. So, it doesn't come as much of a shock when a lot of reporters understandably choose self-censorship just to survive. I mean, look at all the local journalists who know they can't safely report on politicians in bed with cartels or follow the dirty money from drug profits. Those are all big red lines that'll get you killed if you cross them.
We'll keep on informing, but the most important thing is to stay alive.
Even battle-hardened correspondents start to sweat when it hits them that the wrong story calling out the official lies or connecting the wrong dots could turn them, or their loved ones, for that matter, into the next fallen martyr, just like Haber Lopez. So biting your tongue really does become less about journalistic ethics and more about raw survival instinct. Now, imagine being one of these reporters. You might think you're in the clear, asking about one thing, but then you trip some invisible wire. Next thing you know, vicious cartels with major firepower have you in their sights, and it's not just you on the line, your whole family could be at risk too.
Que el alcalde se enojó que lo expuso, ¿no? Con este video, ¿no? Diciendo lo que estaba pasando en su ciudad, en su pueblo.
Sí, y a los días, o sea, él le informan de que el alcalde pensaba darle un susto, ¿no? Y curiosamente 2 días después es que sucede, o sea, que vienen a la casa y se lo llevan.
So the people still hell-bent on getting the real story in these media dead zones are finding the threats hitting closer and harder by the day, like what happened to this tough young crime reporter in Veracruz State. Her name is Norma, and her crime, she posted a picture that, unbeknownst to her, helped to identify the head of a cartel.
Ya no hay nada, ya no hay nada. ¿Eh?
Bueno, llévame eso que fui yo.
Ya.
Me quieren bajar la madre a mí, mamá.
Almost instantly, wave after wave of death threats poured in from every direction. Texts, calls, social media, everything. The message was crystal clear. These narco thugs were out to get her, all because she was doing her basic duties as a journalist.
En aquel momento, pues tenía a mi hija y pues sí, de repente me dicen, y vamos con lo que más quieres.
But she wasn't about to push her luck. She hit up the emergency tip lines, pulled together an escape plan, and she ran away because she might have messed with the wrong brutal players by pure chance on a routine police ride-along.
Y le dije a mi papá, que es con el que vivo también, y le dije, ¿sabes qué? Prepara maletas y nos vamos. Y fue en ese momento que me dijo él no. O sea, yo cómo me voy, cómo dejo mi casa, cómo dejo mis cosas. Me separé de mi papá, preparé maletas y en unas horas salí de aquí.
After she got to safety in some undisclosed spot, the ice-cold reality of being a truth teller in today's Mexico really sank in.
Pues muy difícil. Muy difícil porque te digo que la vida te cambia en un instante.
The second you step up to actually fulfill that sacred duty as democracy's watchdog, you paint a giant bullseye on your own back for the criminal empires and their crooked government pals to aim at. But if you keep quiet and play nice with the information blackout these cartels are pushing, then congrats. You just threw your principles in the gutter and betrayed the whole reason you became a journalist. In the aftermath, when the news broke about Haber Lopez getting gunned down in cold blood, this vicious new status quo hit like a truck, even for the most hardened vets who knew their way around Mexico's tangled narcosphere. Seen-it-all war reporters who'd previously dodged fate on dicey investigations watched the last threads of ethics and rules vanish in real time as lawlessness took over.
También ser periodista en México es moverse en un campo minado, ¿no? Es que tú sepas en tu contexto con quiénes puedes hacer y qué preguntas y hasta dónde puedes llegar si quieres sobrevivir.
And don't think for a second that the Mexican government doesn't have their hands tied right now. The cold, hard math says journalists all over Mexico have pretty much been thrown to the wolves by their own broken government too. Former Mexico President AMLO's indifference to the surge in violence against reporters and the laws meant to protect press freedoms telegraphs a fat green light for the cartels to keep right on restraining anyone who dare shine a light on inconvenient facts.
Señor presidente, estoy acá en Nueva York. ¿Sería posible hacer una pregunta?
Ahora sí le damos oportunidad.
¿Usted está dispuesto a reconocer que su gobierno, bajo su mandato, ha fallado y está fallando en establecer las condiciones necesarias para el libre ejercicio de la prensa en el territorio? Es decir, ¿está dispuesto, sí o no, a asumir la responsabilidad de este problema tan grave?
Estoy asumiendo la responsabilidad. No solo eso. Estoy trabajando para garantizar la paz y la tranquilidad a los mexicanos.
Instead of dropping the hammer on the corruption and lawlessness that's hijacking the nation, critics are saying that AMLO would rather serve up cheap pandering like funding bumps for safety programs everyone knows are way too little, way too late. The federal mechanism for journalist and human rights defender protection is a top-to-bottom dumpster fire that's totally outclassed by the sheer volume of threats.
El problema está peor hoy que nunca. Está peor ahora que nunca.
No.
¿Cómo así? Eso
No es así. No es así.
Sure, they hand out bulletproof vests, push-button panic alarms, even emergency relocations for journalists caught in the crosshairs, but the total lack of bad guy deterrence shows it's all for show. You've got watchdog groups reporting at least 9 journalists actively enrolled in these so-called protection programs, still getting hit since just 2017 alone.
Eso te lo entregó el mismo gobierno federal.
Así es.
The mechanism is not the solution to guarantee the safety of any journalists in Mexico. They have not done, and they will not do it, because there are elements and resources to do so. What the current government lacks is the will to guarantee the safety of all the journalists who are at risk.
Para mí se me hace un botón muy tonto. Si fuera para una emergencia, no vas a poder. Para mí no sirve de nada, solamente para encontrar tu cuerpo.
The brutal truth is no Kevlar-plated security detail will ever turn this sinister tide because Mexico's judicial institutions have been rotted from within by the same narco-state dead set on throttling independent journalism.
If you don't catch the guy that masterminded it, then it sends a clear message, that people are untouchable.
Yeah, that's important for us. We want to have all the change of command happening in those cases, and not only in the murders, also in all kind of attacks. We are improving our investigations, and we have been getting better results in those cases.
But a whole decade deep now, the country's specialized Federal Prosecutors Division, dedicated to locking up the men behind these crimes, has scored just 6 total convictions to show for at least 106 officially confirmed reporter hits between 2010 and 2021. And that's not even counting the stacks of victims too petrified to report direct retaliation for fear of getting hit themselves. And it's a total night and day difference between the last few stubborn reporters still trying to do honest, ethical journalism and the massive wave of crime and chaos that's rapidly turning society into a full-blown narco state. This war for Mexico's soul is playing out one horrific crime scene at a time, and the rest of the world is turning a blind eye, which is only making the problem worse. This isn't a war fought with guns and bullets, but with the tireless determination to document the grotesque reality on the ground, the very thing that the shadow powers are desperately trying to erase from public memory. The million-dollar question is whether those last fading sparkles of real journalism can survive being stomped out under the boot of a system where the bad guys always win, or if, by some miracle, they might just spark a rebirth of transparency and people power in a country where the social contract is all but gone. It all hinges on whether the rest of us have the guts to face the slow-motion slaughter happening in plain sight. Because the second we look away and let the final curtain of silence fall, we become accomplices to the failure of Mexico's democratic experiment. We're at a defining crossroads in history, and we have to choose. Will we wake up, amplify the last defiant voices, speaking truth to power, and have the backs of these freedom fighters who are defending the right to cold, hard facts? Or will we let the bad guys rewrite reality as they please, unopposed? But if we share these stories, if we keep one foot in the trenches with the last brave souls refusing to go quietly into the night, maybe we have a shot at pulling Mexico back from the brink before it's too late. This is the choice in front of us, as witnesses to a band of truth-tellers fighting a life or death battle for the right to call a spade a spade. Will we open our ears, arm ourselves with the unvarnished facts, and go to the mat for that most fundamental freedom to see and describe reality as it is? Lies be damned. Or will we let the last tortured gasps of a dying free press fade into the static, drowned out by the deafening silence of a world where the only truth is what the guys with the guns say it is? That's the real question here. Remember, when the grisly details of Haber Lopez's shooting came to light, they revealed an even more disturbing web of connections between dirty politicians, organized crime, and the silencing of journalists who dared to report the real story. While Arminda Espinosa Cartels herself was never formally charged, the international journalist protection organizations made a point to call out the well-known rumors of her family's deep ties to the most ruthless drug cartels running the show in Oaxaca and beyond.
Si andas de hocicón, se te mocha la lengua. Si andas de dedo, se te mochan los dedos. Si metes la cabeza donde no te llaman, se te mocha la cabeza.
This was exactly the kind of radioactive, heavily guarded information that the cartels and their bought and paid for government associates have shown time and again they'll unleash holy hell to control. Haber Lopez, a virtual unknown outside of hardcore activist circles, seems to have struck a nerve by digging into the hush-hush details around a major federal infrastructure project linked to President AMLO's big development push in southern Mexico. It's the same stunned refrain you hear from the grief-stricken families each and every time another one of the 133 journalists that have been slain since 2006 gets added to the tally. The cold, hard data shows that in Mexico, time and time again, there's no single smoking gun that makes the cartels unleash their fury on any journalist who decides to take their role. This is the real pandemic, the total breakdown of every institution that ushers in Mexico's transformation into a failed narco state straight out of a zombie apocalypse movie, a place where objective facts and hard numbers become unaffordable luxuries that those in power simply can't allow. A place where the public's sacred right to an uncensored reality is being wiped out, one dead truth-teller at a time. So there you have it, the raw, unfiltered truth about the life or death struggle for press freedom and basic human decency in Mexico. It's a lot to take in, but this is the reality that brave journalists like Haber Lopez are facing every single day, and it's on all of us to make sure their sacrifices aren't in vain. So, I want to hear from you. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story moved you, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel, because together we can shine a light into the darkness and make sure the voices of the silenced are never forgotten. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay safe.